Souls to the Polls Wisconsin and the League of Progressive Seniors bring you this discussion on Wisconsin's fight for fair maps. Wisconsin needs legislation that creates a permanent solution to this problem and ensures fair maps for future generations. Using an independent, nonpartisan body to draw maps and prohibiting the use of political and voting data in their development would result in fair maps for Wisconsin.
There are three claims that we brought before the Supreme Court. Contiguity is number one, separation of powers is number two, and then the partisan gerrymander is number three. So contiguity, going back to number one, is the idea we talked about that districts should be contiguous. This is one of the requirements, and it means that it should all be touching. There are a lot of districts where there are little tiny dots all around, and they're not contiguous. They're not part of a community of interest. They're just some island floating in the state, and that violates the contiguity requirement. Now, there are some times where a river or a lake might separate, certain people, and so that makes sense. If you have a geographic reason for separating these communities, fine. But if you're just circling areas where there's a collection of Democratic voters so that they can be packed in with this other Democratic district, that is unconstitutional. Another of our claims is a separation of powers argument, and that argues that goes back to how the legislature passed these maps after the census, and the Governor Evers vetoed these maps. But then when the case went up to the Supreme Court essentially rubber stamped the legislature's maps. And our claim is that by approving and instituting these maps that the governor had vetoed without a legislative override, without a 2/3 vote to override the veto, the court has messed with the separation of powers here, and that was an improper reliance on maps that had previously been vetoed instead of going back to the legislative session for a vote, a 2/3 vote. So that's the separation of powers argument. And then the third claim is the partisan gerrymander claim. And that's the claim that these districts have been so gerrymandered that they're no longer constitutional. They no longer represent the one, every vote matters principle, and that every voter, should be effectively represented in Congress. The Supreme Court has decided to take up two of those issues, the contiguity and the separation of powers argument, but they declined to take up the partisan gerrymander issue, unfortunately. That doesn't mean that they've said that the maps are constitutional or that partisan gerrymander is okay. They just said that that's not appropriate for a case to go directly to the Supreme Court. They didn't give a lot of reasoning in their order, but that issue is still very important to us. It's top priority, and we're considering sort of how best to address that at this point, at the same time focusing on the remaining claims of contiguity and separation of powers. The remedy that we're seeking is that these current maps are invalidated, and that there is a process, and the Supreme Court can decide what this process is, but that there's some process for drawing neutral and constitutional maps. And that could be a special master that's appointed by the Supreme Court to do that work. And then because our clients live in Democratic as well as Republican districts, we have asked that all of the legislators that are part of, that have been elected, even those that wouldn't be up for re-election in 2024, that they all must be re-elected. All of the senators and representatives from our clients' districts have to be up for re-election next November with new and fair districts. So that's it for the case, and that leaves some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
So unlike Wisconsin, Michigan has their constitution allows citizen-initiated constitutional amendments, because there, as in Wisconsin, in order to get an independent commission that is not controlled by the legislature to draw the maps, we need to amend our constitution. So they organized, they got signatures, they got a constitutional amendment to allow really independent redistricting on the ballot, and they passed it. And that's why, that's how they got it. And we can't even do advisory referenda anymore, right? The last budget, they even took that right away from us. So unfortunately, we do not have that path.
Fun fact, the Senate votes by paper ballot, so you can't see them and vote. We do, when we have an executive, which means like a bill has had a public hearing, and then we have another meeting where we vote and discuss and have amendments. The Senate does that by paper ballot, so you can't see them do that. Just your unfunded anti-democratic fact for the day. If that bill goes forward, if there's any amendment that's put on it in the Senate, that has to go back to the Assembly. To what committee, we don't know, because it never had a committee hearing. So if it doesn't get any amendments and it passes the Senate, then it goes to the governor, who will 100% veto it. After that, they can try to override the governor's veto. Now, that is possible because in the Senate, Republicans have a supermajority, so they can just pass it through if all the Republicans agree. I don't believe that the Republicans in the Senate are in alignment with that this is a good idea. I was actually surprised that it got a public hearing to begin with. So if it gets out of the Senate and it goes to the governor and then it is vetoed, it would have to have an override. They could override it in the Senate because they have a supermajority. They could override it in the Assembly. There are only 2 seats in the Assembly between that is standing in the way of a supermajority. So they can wait until there are 2 Democrats absent or not there, hit the gavel and override the veto. Which is why currently the Democrats in the Assembly, we are in Madison an awful lot because we have these things called skeletal sessions where they're kind of adjourned, but at any second we may be able to be in session and they could start rolling some bills through. So if you're represented by an Assembly Democrat, thank them, because it's a lot of work to make sure that we're always there just in case bills might start rolling. So it is that close.
Alabama is saying their maps are not racially drawn, they are politically drawn. So it seems to be that you can draw a map politically that represents. So how does that work? I mean, I don't want to talk about Alabama, but that's an interesting, and the Supreme Court is looking at that. So that seems to be, it would have great ramifications on gerrymandering.
Yeah, so you're talking about the difference between a racial gerrymander and a partisan gerrymander, and the case in Alabama is a federal case about racial gerrymander, and what's happened there, and, just very briefly is, what's happened very briefly is that the courts have said these maps are not, they're not viable under the Voting Rights Act because of inappropriate racial gerrymanders. You need to go back and draw them again. And the government's gone and drawn sort of like a tiny little tweak, and they've said, how about this? And the court said, no, you gotta do better. And they've drawn like a little tiny tweak, and they've gone back, and there's been this very annoying iterative process. That case is very different, and it brings up a good point, which is that we have not brought any federal claims. We are not challenging this on the basis of a racial gerrymander. We are not bringing this under the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, excuse me. And there are some strategic reasons for that, but we have challenged a partisan gerrymander, a gerrymander that is so heavily favoring one party that it is no longer democratic and it is no longer constitutional. And so our case is independent. It is in state court. It is only relying on the state constitution and state claims. And so what happens in Alabama, of course, it is relevant sort of in the political world, but it may not be directly relevant legally.
Well, this paper says if the case prevails, every member of the legislature is up for re-election, and you said the 19 districts that are challenging it would be up for re-election, and that's a big difference between...
That's my fault.
Okay.
Because I put both of those in because I wanted to figure out which was right.
Okay.
And I don't know the answer to which is right, so.
Well, we're both right. Do you need me to repeat the question? Okay. So we're both right. there are legislators that were already planning to be up for re-election, right? This was their normally scheduled election. And what our case has done has included all of the legislators that would not normally be up for election, as a way of saying that even these legislators that normally would not be up for election in November of 2024 must run again, even though their term has not ended, on the theory that their district has been drawn in an unconstitutional way. And so I'm sorry for that confusion. Thanks for clarifying it.
Can I just add to that? So if you're in the assembly, you have a 2-year term. So every 2 years you're up for election. The entire assembly is up for election. If you're in the Senate, you have a 4-year term. And it's staggered. So half of the Senate is up every 2 years, and then the other half of the Senate. The reason you couldn't keep the Senate districts in place is because the way our maps are drawn, inside each Senate district is nested 3 assembly districts. So I have Senator Dan Knodl's Senate district, and there are 3 districts inside there, 23, 24, and I forget the other number. 22, thank you. So if you were to change the Senate district and not have them up for election, they would represent a different area than the pieces inside of it. So it would be this very messy puzzle. So if you're going to have new maps, you really have to have the senators up for election, because they would be you could have a place where the Senate district changes so much that they're not represented by any senator or none, and so that's why it is cleaner to have them all up at a time.
A couple of weeks ago, Bruce Thompson had an interesting article in Urban Milwaukee about, it was addressing why the Republicans looking at the Iowa model was a bad idea. But Thompson also raised a couple of other issues that I think were important. One has to do with proportionality. In other words, you want to have districts that are kind of proportional, at least overall, to what that party's share of the statewide vote would be. He argued that the only way you can get to that, understanding what would be a good proportion be for a particular district, would be if you looked at election data. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
I can start anyway. So, yeah, proportionality is the idea that the proportion of Democrats and Republicans represented in the legislature mirrors the overall, the statewide proportion. So, you know, like most of our statewide elected officials are Democratic, so you would want if it were proportional, you want a legislature that mirrors that. You do, whether you do it on, so one of the problems I think with the current bill is that it forbids using election data for anything. And although I think it's probably important to draw the districts without using the partisan data, the voting data, that you need to check it, right? Because, and you can check it after the fact and then revise the map, and that's actually what the People's Maps Commission did. Revise the maps if you determine that there really is a wildly disproportionate representation of one party over the other. It is true that I do not think you can get fully proportional maps for the legislature without using voter data to manipulate the districts. And, you know, Republicans exaggerate it. So they're like, well, you can't use any voting data at all. Well, you have to use some. And a truly fair representative map probably wouldn't give us complete proportionality, because there's some element of truth to what the Republicans say about, you know, they're much more dispersed, right, through the rural areas, and Democrats are much more concentrated in the urban areas, which is why too strict adherence to the compactness standard is really, really going to disadvantage Democrats. But that's one of many criteria. So, but a fair map would not give us a 2/3 veto-proof majority, right? So you can have a fair map that still might mildly favor Republicans, but is much fairer than what we have now. So that would be my argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify Justice Protasewicz's status. My understanding is if they don't impeach her before December 1st, it will be okay because then she'll be, the replacement will be appointed by Governor Evers. And if they impeach her before December 1st, we'll have to have another spring election for another justice. Is that correct, what I said?
My understanding is something similar, and I'm not sure on the details. It's kind of like arcane process that maybe never happened before. If it did, it's a while ago. But it's something to the effect of there's a date in December. I thought it was December 2nd, but after which the justice who's appointed would have a much longer tenure, before which it would be a much shorter tenure. We're still hoping for no impeachment. We think there's no basis for it, and it sounds like Robin Buss has backed away from that threat.
Yeah, December 1st is a funny date because there can be action on December 1st and then the status changes December 2nd.
I just want to clarify too. So if the way impeachment would work is there would be an impeachment vote in the Assembly. If the Assembly votes to impeach, then the actual impeachment action or trial would be held in the Senate. So there is a scenario where if the Assembly votes to impeach, the Senate doesn't take up any action. As soon as the Assembly votes to impeach, if that is what Robin Buss decides to do, Justice Protasewicz is not allowed to rule in any cases. So there is a scenario where the Assembly acts and the Senate doesn't, and she's in legal limbo. And yeah, so we thought that Speaker Buss was backing off on his impeachment threat. He did say in the news that it's not off the table. So we don't know what's going to happen next. But just so you understand how that process would work, and there is a scenario where she's not actually impeached, but she's rendered incapable of voting.
Thank you. Bill.
I've been in touch with a couple of the mathematicians that you referred to, and they say that if you do not use the election data, about the best you can do is about a 45% of the seats. In other words, we'll have a better map than we have now, for sure, but we will not have much of a chance. In fact, it's in the second order of decimal points of having a majority in the Senate or in the House, or in the Assembly, I'm sorry. Which means that you don't have the committee chairs, you don't have the control of the legislation, and so on. So in other words, after all of the trouble we went to get Janet in there, we're going to accept a map that is better, but still very inferior to proportionality. Is that what we're hearing?
I think that's possible. I would argue that what we wanted, the better criterion to use would be competitiveness at the district level. Because if you draw districts to try to be, and it would still require using voting data to check that, right? But if you maximize the number of competitive districts, that at least gives a better shot, right? And it would require Republicans to actually listen to people. So I do think it would be better. I think it's a really tall order to ask for, legally to ask for proportionality to be used without a constitutional amendment. So, I mean, which is what Michigan did. You know, they were able to write their constitutional amendment to say that partisan fairness is one of the things that the maps have to satisfy. In the absence of a constitutional amendment, it would be very, very difficult, I think, for us to get there.
So the answer to my question is yes. We are going to accept a map process that will not get us to proportionality, will not get us majorities in any reasonable likelihood. And
I want to answer that. As a Democrat, it is not my goal, through a independent redistricting process, it is not my goal through this process to guarantee a Democratic majority, because that's just gerrymandering in the other
there's
direction.
no guarantees. How about a 50-50 chance?
So if you look at this diagram, you can see how important proportionality is. I believe if we have an independent redistricting process that reflects communities, that does all the things that we're talking about, there is no guarantee, and there shouldn't be a guarantee of a majority. And we can perfectly have a situation, given what Wisconsin's landscape, where we have a closer majority, right? So if, say, from my point of view as a legislator, if we have a 5-seat Republican majority, that is much more workable, and you will see a lot more bills passing, because first of all, we are electing more moderate Republicans in an ideal world, and Democrats who are able to compromise, because when you have such a small majority, you can actually get some things done. And so if districts are competitive, people are competing in a fair fight, and they're winning on their ideas. And so I always say, look, as a Democrat, we win statewide elections. I know that my message is a winner. I know that our policies are what people want, because whenever we vote on statewide, because you can't gerrymander a state, we narrowly win. So I, as a Democrat, am willing to run on my message in the district that is fair and competitive and win on that. When we start talking about proportionality that is guaranteed, I see it as gerrymandering in the opposite direction. So my intent is that we have, first of all, we're protecting the districts that are guaranteed by the Voting Rights Act and ensuring that our minority districts can elect the candidate of their choice. I am personally advocating to eradicate prison gerrymandering, which I think would go a long way towards rebalancing districts in Wisconsin and restoring voters who happen to be incarcerated but are counted way in the middle of nowhere, which is giving power to districts elsewhere and taking power away from where their home is. And if we can do that, and if we can have competitive districts, we will get at a map that is competitive. The Republicans are not wrong when they say that Democrats cluster in cities, because we do. That does give them a slight majority. It doesn't give them a 2/3 supermajority. So we do have a Democratic challenge. It is not nearly what the Republicans say that it is. So yes, proportionality is important. We should see at the end of this process that our statewide vote represents the district vote. But I want to be very careful, so we're not simply saying, okay, we have a 51% Democratic vote, we need Democratic maps, because that's when you start getting into gerrymanders.
Can I just add one thing really quick? And that is that Michigan uses partisan fairness, and one of the results of that, and this demonstrates the fact that these different mapping criteria have trade-offs. It's impossible to get the perfect world on all of them. The Detroit area lost 2 black representatives as a result of their recent redistricting. So they got much better maps from the perspective of overall Democratic majorities, but they lost minority representation, and that's one of the things that they're working on trying to fix.
So I think we'll take one more question, if there's one more question. Yes.
Can you address taking us out of ERIC?
Wait, what was the question?
Taking us out of ERIC,
ERIC is
data
the
sharing,
database that
voting
tells who
sharing.
voted how and used for research. And I think it's a bigger company because they did the databases for schools too. I mean, it isn't just for voting. It's a huge database.
Does somebody know the answer to that?
I'm not an ERIC expert. What I do know is that ERIC is I didn't know what the acronym stands for, but it basically is a system that clerks use to help prevent voter fraud. Those who believe that the 2020 election was stolen have propagated this rumor that ERIC helps, it can send out messages and can do things, and that it is a element of voter fraud. But actually, it is designed to prevent voter fraud. Just this morning, there was a story on NPR about that and how they use DMV data to verify voters so that John Smith, who's voting in Wisconsin, is not the same John Smith who is voting in Texas, for example. And it's boggled my mind why Republicans want to leave this when they're the ones who are saying, oh, we need to do all of these things to ensure that our elections are not fraudulent. It makes absolutely no sense. And I'm just repeating what I heard on the news this morning. Well, it turns out that there are some conservatives who have an alternative product to ERIC that they're trying to sell to states. So look for the grift, right? So again, I am not an expert in it, but the move to leave ERIC has been circulated by conspiracy theorists and people who believe that the 2020 election was stolen.
Whoa, on that note, the tech note. This is a great panel. I suggested do a road show.